Taking a second. I may not have as fast a line as I normally have at my house. Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, February 23rd, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today continues phase 2 of our webinar 9 in the series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. It's topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and chairman of the committee is Neil Waldrop, whom I am turning this facilitation of this webinar over to right now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. We have an exciting topic today, at least a topic that has much excitement built into it. The arguments among early Christians were very intense, not always entirely quiet, not always entirely unviolent. In fact, there were quite some violent elements involved. In any case, thank you, Bob, and thank you, the viewers who are joining us. As Bob stated, we are discussing a segment of Revelation Revealed, topic 8. And for any of you who are watching and you do not have that document in front of you, I recommend that you download it from the committee, from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is treated as a single word without any hyphenation or space in the middle. And today we will begin on page 96. We have just concluded a discussion of the organizational and structural aspects that Christianity inherited from the Roman Empire. Now we're returning to the narrative of the philosophic and theological debates that ensued, mainly in the 4th and 5th centuries, but they inherited arguments that had been going on since the very beginning of Christianity. So please turn to page 96 of Revelation Revealed. We previously read the paragraph that begins with the words, although controversies. But I think for continuity, I would like that paragraph to be our starting point today. Marvin, could you read that paragraph and the one that follows in the middle of page 96, since Christianity is, and then there are three ticks that occur on the top of page 97. So I'd like you to go through all of this at once, please.
So you'd like me to stop at the three-lined text at the bottom, at the top of 97, right?
Yes, the last two words you would read will then be decisively different.
Great, got it. Although controversies over the nature and identity of Jesus simmered among diverse communities of Christian believers during the next 250 years, these disagreements did not become prominent and important in public until the Emperor Constantine decided to sponsor and patronize institutional Christianity in the year 313 CE, Christian era.
Excuse me, it stands for current era.
Oh, it's current era, sorry. For his part, Constantine appears to have imagined his subjects intoning some semi-magical mantra that would amount to, quote, one empire, one emperor, one God, one faith, unquote. To his chagrin, however, he rapidly discovered that many professional Christians of his day were factious and bumptious, displaying a disarming tendency to exacerbate disagreements by hurling invective, instead of seeking to develop reasonable and perhaps subtle compromises that might enable them to reach agreement on key features of Christian belief and practice. Since Christianity had unquestionably morphed into a religion about Jesus, Christian believers of that day found it necessary to define his nature and identity clearly and precisely. After all, the issues were complex and delicate. So I'm assuming that what I'm about to read then is sort of some summary of the complexity and delicacy of those issues, or at least some commentary.
A list of them, and we can talk about the delicacy and complexity as we go along. Go ahead.
Okay. The Midwear Commission implicitly...
No. Excuse me.
You want me to read
the note at the bottom of the page, which pertains actually to the controversies earlier about the Apostle Paul. I want you to go to the top of page 97.
Got it.
And read the three ticks that are there.
Got it. So after all, the issues were complex and delicate. Was Jesus a divine person and a human person, or only one of the above? And if so, which one? Did Jesus have one nature and one will, or two of each? How exactly did Jesus relate to the Father? Did he share the same spiritual substance, homos? Can you pronounce that, Neil?
I'm not sure. I can try. Homoousios, and the other is probably homoiousios.
Okay. Did he share the same spiritual substance, homoousios, which I'm assuming is a Greek term, or just manifest a similar substance? For any of you who are particularly adventurous or perhaps particularly rash, you may wish to pronounce those two words in Greek and then explain to the rest of us why they are decisively different.
Well, I will pick up the ball on that particular point. The first one, homoousios, means identical. And the second word, homoiousios, means similar or like. And so this is the argument whether in this particular text, Jesus was identical in substance to the Father, or on the contrary, was of a like substance to the Father. But I'd like to back up a bit. Bob, did you wish to interject a comment here?
I did look it up. I don't know if I was adventurous or rash. Probably more rash now that I'm trying to add something to this. But the difference between those two words is the I, and the Greek word for I is iota. So the phrase only different, it's only different by one iota is where that actually came from, believe it or not. And there's more than one reference that I didn't single source that just through Google, by the way. So the difference is quite important in these conversations, I think, that we're going to have going forward. Over.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I didn't know that the idea of just an iota's difference is related to this question, but it's extremely relevant, actually. But I would like to drop back to the first tick of the three that Marvin read, and I will read it again. Was Jesus a divine person and a human person, or only one of the above? And if so, which one? Charles, would you like to characterize or comment on the various opinions on this question?
Various opinions? Well, there are three of them, three sets. That he was the same person, or he was divine, or he was human. And then maybe there are variations in those. He was more divine than human, or vice versa. I would say he was the same person. Personality is not divisible. It is indivisible and well, original. Yes?
That's fine as a telescope on the process that lasted these 125 years, what eventually emerged in the definition of Chalcedon. But there were conflicting views of this. Stephen, would you be willing to characterize the conflicting views of Jesus as a person, divine or human?
Well, Charles got started. In a basic sense, there are those believers who are more Jewishly oriented that the most extreme of them thought of Jesus as a human person who was eventually adopted by God and was raised into the status, if you were a Jewish Christian, raised by God to the status of the Messiah, if you were a Jewish Christian. If you're Jewish and not a Christian, you didn't believe that Jesus was Messiah, nor that he was divine. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there are those Gentile Christians, basically, who believe that Jesus was only divine and not human, that his human appearance was, his humanity was only an illusion or just an appearance. It was only skin deep, that he was truly divine, and in that sense, he could not die, and he could not die on the cross. And that was the other extreme. Now, I don't believe that anybody at the time believed that there were two persons, a divine person and a human person. As Charles said, personality is indivisible. What people did think, and I think this was the best of the various syntheses that came up, was that he was one person united with a divine nature and a human nature. And so he had one one personality uniting two natures.
Thank you. I will simply state that what you have just given was the version that ultimately triumphed, at least from the perspective of Western Christianity, called the two-nature argument. The one-nature argument was championed by the Patriarch of Alexandria for quite some years, and it emphasized that Jesus was a divine person and that his human attributes essentially were an accessory to his divine nature. And this argument went on quite a while, in fact, throughout the entire period that we're going to discuss. So, in effect, the comments from Charles and Stephen by implication, have already clarified the nature of the second tick on that page. Did Jesus have one nature and one will, or two of each? Because the idea of will is associated with personality, and they believe they've covered that already. No, I would make the third tick that Marvin and I had fun with, and as assisted by Bob's dictionary ransacking, in the third tick. And that one, it talks about, I will say like, or I will say identical or similar, as a way of avoiding another attempt to pronounce those two words in Greek. The additional point that became tied up with this question, which was already quite difficult itself, was something called subordinationism. I don't know if someone would like to talk about the question of subordinationism. Doreen, is that something you might be willing to talk about?
Well, I'll tell you what I found was that, well, he said the Father and I are one, but it said that he's God and man combined, a dual experience working within man's nature and the will of the Paradise Father. He comes from the Father just as an original eternal Son. As Spirit, God is manifest in the person of the eternal Son. He is the absolute personality. He revealed God to man and man to God, and all, not only that, but all the superhuman personalities, intelligences. His creative prerogatives will remain with his mortal personality and can't be separated. So I'm not sure. It said, let's see, his power. So the Spirit of truth is power in our hearts. But yes, of course, he had to succumb to the will of the Father, but he did that because of who he was. And I love the fact that we learned about each other. He brought God to us, and then how all these superhuman personalities, all the divine beings or the deities above, learned about us. So, did you say separatism? Is that what you asked me?
What you said was quite interesting and useful, but my question specifically was the theory called subordinationism.
Subordination.
That Jesus was subordinate to the Father instead of being equal.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Well, that isn't the view that came out of this whole long process. Stephen?
So subordinationism is mostly identified with the person of Arius, who generated what's called the Arian controversy. And it's mentioned briefly further down in this page. So Arius would say that even though Jesus and the Father are very closely related, you might say his followers entered the eye into the word homoousios. And his argument was that based on the New Testament, based on the writings of the New Testament, that Jesus repeatedly referred to the Father as in some way superior, and that he was serving the will of the Father. That's repeated many, many times in the New Testament. So based on that evidence and also Greek philosophy, which we won't get into, he determined that Jesus was in some way subordinate not only to the will of the Father, which I don't think anybody would argue, but also his nature was in some way less. I won't say the word inferior, but in some way that there can only be one true ungenerated Godhead or God, and that Jesus was in some way generated out of the Godhead. Now that was determined to be a heresy in Christianity, and we'll talk about that quote in blue down the page, but it's very close in many ways to what the Urantia book says. And it's very ironic that Arius is basically condemned by the revelators here in this quote below. But he basically had the right idea. He didn't have all the details correct, but he basically had the right idea.
I think there are nuances of detail here where one can look at Arius' teachings from different perspectives. He did not agree that Jesus was on a plane of equality. In other words, the idea that Jesus was the second person of the Trinity was something that he did not fully agree with. On the other hand, he did say that Jesus had a spiritual identity that was on a high level and that Jesus was like the Father. And I think your point, Stephen, about the irony is interesting, because the revelators do tell us that Jesus, which is to say the personal identity of Christ Michael of Nebadon when he was living on earth bestowed as Jesus of Nazareth, is not an equal to the Paradise Universal Father, that he is not part of the Trinity, of the Paradise Trinity, consisting of the Universal Father, the Eternal Son, and the Infinite Spirit. And so this leads me to wonder why Jesus did not make this clear to his followers. One of the issues that we look at over this time is that it's pretty fair to say that the early Christians were operating in the blind. Jesus did not teach them about who he was or his relationship to the Father. He went through his life. He was subordinate to the will of the Father. We know that from what the revelators tell us. But he did not talk about his nature or identity in precisely these terms. And one can postulate different situations in which he might have taught about that, but he didn't. Doreen, would you like to comment on why Jesus did not talk about himself?
Well, I thought the same thing when I was reading all those the chapters that you gave us to read. And I thought, why didn't he inform them of not only who he was, but look at the results of not informing them and not giving them enough information. But even the information he did give them, they didn't understand. They still didn't understand right to the end. But what I had about Arius is that he maintained that Jesus was neither a perfect man nor a perfect God, and that he was consisted of a secondary substance, or essence, what the Usius, he says, and not enough to call him divine upon God's level. And his theory was considered too much like the pagan philosophers that God was a demigod. So he said his followers believed the Holy Spirit was not part of the Godhead, simply one of the ministering spirits who differ only slightly from the angels. And that's what I had, just to follow up what you said.
Thank you. It's interesting, and I largely agree. I was going to throw my next question toward Charles, but I saw Bob's hand go up, and therefore I will direct it at him. Before you elaborate in the direction that you were inclined to elaborate, Bob, I will repeat the question that I asked Doreen. Why didn't Jesus teach about himself and his nature and identity?
My theory about this, speculation about this, is that he didn't want to foster an ongoing religion about Jesus, rather than where they actually really made the mistakes. So when Paul started teaching, about the Jesus and his life, it automatically forced all of these discussions without having enough information, and it set Christianity into a path that they didn't want, that Jesus apparently didn't want them to go. So my thinking is that he did kind of there is a one paragraph, and I can't remember exactly where it is. I can find it and show it later, but Jesus did tell some of the apostles, about his divine and human natures combined, but they really didn't understand it, according to the midwayers. So to provide that information would have been too early for the purpose of the revelation, of the fourth epochal revelation. And frankly, I think it needed to wait until the fifth, because we have such a deeper understanding about not only the seven absolutes of infinity, but how the creator's sons are created, where the eternal son fits into that, and so on and so forth. But by doing that, by Paul beginning to teach or to preach about Jesus, it set it off where they had to do this discussion, where they had to come and try to figure out whether he had a dual nature, a single nature, or just a human nature. It was a path that I believe Jesus didn't want them to take, which is why he didn't teach about it in my mind.
Thank you, Bob. I certainly agree that Paul taught about Jesus. His innovation compared with the teachings of the other apostles was to teach about Jesus having died for our sins and being the path to salvation. But in fairness, Peter taught about Jesus on the day of Pentecost. And so the idea that Christianity, or the followers of Jesus, consisted of a religion whose adherents had certain beliefs about Jesus antedated Paul. It started right away with Peter's statements on the day of Pentecost. Marvin, you motioned that you'd like to speak. Are you still in the mood?
Yes, thank you, Neil. So your question is, why didn't Jesus give more clarity on his own nature and his relationship to the Father? and I think, from my point of view, he didn't, because he didn't think it was important. Number one, relatively, and number two, he actually felt that to give that kind of information and focus unduly on his own nature was counterproductive and misleading. And I want to go back to the statement that you put at the head of these three questions. Since Christianity had unquestionably morphed into a religion about Jesus, the Christian believers of that day found it necessary to define his nature and identify an identity clearly and precisely. And it's interesting, throughout the Urantia book, there are constant warnings not to focus unduly on the religion about Jesus or his person or his nature, or even about his relationship to the Father, but to focus on the religion of Jesus, how he lived, his spiritual life, and to try and follow the example of how he lived his spiritual life, because that's what he was trying primarily to show us, is that we could have some downstep version of what he had, which is intimate communion and loving relationship with the Father. And that's what he wanted the apostles to focus on. And of course, they immediately left that primary focus and focused on the religion about Jesus. And it was because of that error that they felt the need to unduly and precisely define his nature. The interesting thing is that with this revelation, which has the advantage of being 2,000 pages of unaltered, consistent information, where they can give us, everything sort of in right relation to everything else that they want to give us. You see a very clear explication of Jesus' nature and his relationship to the Father, and you see an exhortation to do the same thing Jesus exhorted, which is, don't focus unduly on this information. It's not important. In fact, it's distracting. Focus primarily on how I lived and try to live your lives that way. So I just think that those are sort of some thoughts I've got in response to the material.
Thank you, Marvin. I believe that what you have said is valid as an analysis of the underlying purpose. One can talk about Jesus's motivations and intentions, but it was clear that he did not teach this, that he did not teach about himself. He had a mission, and his mission was spiritual. I think that the trap that the apostles and other early followers had fallen into trapped them into this kind of extended discussion. And undoubtedly, that must have been one of the factors that persuaded Jesus in the first place that he would not be wise to teach about himself, because he did not want them to focus on his nature and identity or those theological traits. He wanted them instead to focus on his teaching. And Marvin has characterized those teachings in a way that I think we can all accept is at least very broad and general and largely correct, although, of course, Marvin would not maintain that he has said everything in his brief remarks that Jesus taught. I can't imagine him saying that. He's not an egotistical person. But anyway, so here we are, and we, in contrast, are stuck with the task of analyzing what happened in Christianity. And to some degree, we've been discussing why it happened. But now I would like to go back to the text of Revelation revealed and ask Stephen to read the paragraph beginning with the words "since the cacophony" and the quotation in a blue frame afterwards, and also the succeeding paragraph as it turned out. Would you please do that?
Since the cacophony in these regards was intensifying, and since it gave no hint that it would soon subside, the Emperor Constantine decided to summon and convene the Council of Nicaea, 325 CE, on his own authority, for no one dared to intimate to the emperor that he needed to obtain anyone's approval or consent. The council operated in Greek, not in Latin, and very few bishops from the western half of the Roman Empire traveled to Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, in order to attend. The Bishop of Rome was not present, but Athanasius was. It was, quote, "It was a Greek from Egypt who so bravely stood up at Nicaea and so fearlessly challenged this assembly that it dared not so obscure the concept of the nature of Jesus that the real truth of his bestowal might have been in danger of being lost to the world. This Greek's name was Athanasius, but for the eloquence and the logic of this believer, the persuasions of Arius would have triumphed." That's paper 195, 0.18. As it turned out, the Council of Nicaea was only the first of an extended series of church councils during which the assembled bishops exchanged views on the nature and identity of Jesus, and also on the spiritual relationships that characterize and define the Trinity. Some of them seem to have been procedurally irregular or defective for other reasons, but the extended series included 2 church councils that were almost as significant as the Council of Nicaea, those held at Constantinople, 381 CE, and at Chalcedon, 451 CE.
All right. So, in effect, what we have is a process that was launched by the imperial authority of the Roman emperor. It was not launched by the Bishop of Rome or any other spiritual figure. It was launched by the emperor as part of his quest for one faith that he thought would be a technique of unifying the Roman Empire at that time. And the intervening paragraph of a quotation, the middle paragraph that Stephen read, talks about the crucial role of Athanasius, who at that time was the personal secretary of the Patriarch of Alexandria. And Athanasius subsequently succeeded him. So we have a brief description of the psychology of that conference, but that council, the Council of Nicaea, did not end the argument. It went on and on and on. And Finally, there was an assertion of the principle of one person with two natures that ultimately won out at the time of the Council of Constantinople in 381, at which point another emperor, Emperor Theodosius I, put his foot down and said, "This is it. Excuse me, you have to do what I'm telling you. I have decided." So these theological arguments were settled by the authority of the Roman emperor. In the case of the Council of Constantinople in 381, it was Theodosius, not Constantine. Then we go for another 70 years, finally to the Council of Chalcedon, 451. And that was very contentious too. At least the lead up to that council was very contentious. We will explore some of these aspects when we go down to the bottom of the page, and someone will read the title of three historical works, and we will explore what the titles imply. But in any event, we have a process which obviously involved the entanglement of church and state, but beyond that, the union of church and state. The church at the time was operating as a department of the imperial government of Rome. Charles, I wonder if anything I've said or anything that Stephen read might attract your attention to the degree that you'd like to comment on it.
Well, Constantine's reaction typically imperial. It reveals an imperial mind. It's typically Roman. It's a governmental point of view. It values law and order. And it was just a matter of transferring this to a theological domain, but still insisting on law and order, particularly order. The Romans placed a supreme value on order, structured by law, so it's not surprising. The tendency toward disagreements throughout remind me of the fractious and bunctious disagreements in modern democracy. It seems to me there's something in human nature that craves for this kind of contention. But it's not surprising that a Roman emperor later would supposedly put an end to it. Of course, he didn't. It was it can only be on the surface. Disputes about deity, divinity, relationships of mortals to divinity, relationships of other deities to higher deities. These are existential, and they just don't go away. You can't order them away. You might be able to suppress them for a generation or so, maybe even longer, but they don't go away. They persist. Jesus relied on the concept of the Son of Man the first 3 or so years of his association with the apostles. It was only later on that teaching or that concept didn't work in the minds of the apostles, that he then emphasized or introduced at least the Son of God concept. And that's not surprising for a man who had devoted his adult life to discerning and doing the will of God. Marvin said something very important, I think that talking about himself was not particularly relevant to the nature of Jesus' bestowal. In any case, it wasn't about him. It was about the Father. He was creating a whole new perspective, existential and experiential perspective. But these back and forth, even at the imperial level, at the highest level of Roman authority, I don't think amounted to anything spiritually significant. And they're noted in history, and to the extent that they influenced the development of Christianity, but really no further. But then what else would one expect the Roman emperor to do but order his way, given that he valued law and order. And again, very Roman. And that's essentially one of the reasons their empire lasted several centuries. So it's why these comments, these readings here in Revelation revealed are wide-ranging, but spiritually they don't amount to anything significant. Now, one last thought. Athanasius came in the nick of time. It's always intrigued me how what really matters is rescued in the nick of time, again and again. And I don't think it was coincidental. I mean, I'm sure he chose to do what he chose, but it was timely. And it's interesting to me how whole movements, whole destinies are determined by a single person, single man or woman who moves in a timely fashion.
Thank you, Charles. Doreen, the golden frame hovered over you. Is this because you asked to speak, or not really?
Sorry, I wanted to ask you a question, and I didn't ask to speak, but did I read that Constantine considered himself to be the 13th apostle? Did you read that?
Yes, I did. And whether he considered himself to be such or not is not clear, but he asked to be buried in a church and would be given that title in that church as the 13th apostle. But whether he believed it or was simply claiming a title, I don't know. But he did ask that this be done. Bob, I'd like to shift to you. We've been talking about differences concerning the nature and identity of Jesus from a spiritual perspective. Most people living today would look at these differences and find them very detailed and frankly not very relevant. Why wasn't it possible for the Roman emperors and the society of that time just to let people believe what they wanted to?
I don't think during the period that all of these discussions and dialogue were going on about the nature of Jesus was really something that the common man, the Hellenized folks that were coming over to Christianity, the pagans that were being mollified, brought into Christianity, Mithraism that needed to be mollified, also brought into Christianity. It seems to me that from the kind of history that I'm reading is that while Jesus instructed the apostles of his divinity, and we've been talking here that, he didn't want to focus on that. And, I brought up the point that focusing on the divinity or on the nature of Jesus would have been a severe distraction. That getting to your question, is that the common man would not have had the context to be able to discuss these things in the way that each of these three councils did, and then permeated the society through the feudalism and the Dark Ages, for it to finally to come back out in the terms of the Renaissance, that where this became a real issue. So Neil, could you state your question again, and I'll try to I've tried to put that context out there.
I think what you said is that the common man would have had trouble distinguishing these fine distinctions, and I think that's true. Although they became slogans, they became rallying cries, they became identified with particular champions, almost in the sense of a boxing champion or a slugger in the baseball game. So the common people were able to accept these slogans and then identify with a particular group. But my original question was why the various authorities, be they Roman emperors, be they bishops, whatever, be they patriarchs, couldn't just let people believe what they wanted to.
Oh, okay. Well, obviously, we talked a little bit about this last week and the week before. The terms that you use are fractious and bumptious, so I'll use them. A common society was disruptive, and emperorship needed to control the levers of government, and to have these activists. The way that I see it is that, and I mentioned this, and I'm still thinking, reflecting upon the fact that the Spirit of Truth had descended upon just a couple hundred years before that, and it was this voltage, this catalyst that created a lot of the activism in thinking about, as soon as the Peter and Paul decided they were going to teach about Jesus, it led them down that path, and there was not enough context. I mean, it really takes until the fifth epochal revelation to really understand the context about the fused divine and human natures of Jesus. What's a Michael? What's a Master Michael, etc. So the emperors obviously had to control society in a way, and they had to control the religious activists. Over.
Okay, Stephen, yours.
Okay, a couple things. First of all, I disagree with the premise of your question. The emperors did not impose a homogeneity on beliefs. It was incredible how tolerant they were to let all this fractiousness and bumptiousness go on for as long as it did. I mean, there's an incredible amount of heterogeneity throughout the empire. And eventually, yes, they did put their foot down, but that was, quite a bit later. We would not tolerate that amount of chaos in our society as the emperors did until finally Theodosius put his foot down. But Constantine, for instance, went back and forth himself between Arianism and the position of Athanasius. So I don't agree with the premise of your question. Second of all, I don't agree with the premise that everybody's assuming that Christianity or the New Testament was only a religion about Jesus. In the Gospels and even in Paul, there's a very large amount of teachings of the religion of Jesus. All the parables, all the stories that portray Jesus in interaction with other people, and the miracles. It's a large amount of material in the Gospels and in Paul that talk about the teachings of Jesus. So it's a caricature to say that the New Testament or even Pauline Christianity was only a religion about Jesus. And I strongly disagree with that.
Thank you. Marvin, you've put your hand up.
Yeah, I agree with you, Steve, by and large, but sort of in juxtaposition with that comment, I want to share a passage. This is 149:2-4. The second great blunder of the Master's early followers, and one which all subsequent generations have persisted in perpetuating, was to organize the Christian teaching so completely about the person of Jesus, and person is italicized. This overemphasis on the personality of Jesus in the theology of Christianity has worked to obscure his teachings. And all of this has made it increasingly difficult for Jews, Mohammedans, Hindus, and other Eastern religionists to accept the teachings of Jesus. We would not belittle the place of the person of Jesus in a religion which might bear his name, but we would not permit such a consideration to eclipse his inspired life or to supplant his saving message, the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. So I think it's one of the error is one of emphasis, overemphasis, and it's just an interesting paragraph. They describe it as the second great blunder, is this overemphasis.
Thank you. I appreciate your initiative in bringing that paragraph to our attention. I would like to react a little bit to remarks that Stephen made earlier. It is true that the process of argument went on for 125 years, but there were decisive points at which certain Roman emperors, mainly Theodosius I in the year 381, and ultimately the Emperor Marcian, Marcian, in 451 at Chalcedon, put their foots down and said, this is it. And so ultimately, the direction of Western Christianity was established by this principle of authority. Now, what I was hoping for, and obviously have not been able to obtain from you, the group, is a connection with the structural and organizational principles that Christianity inherited from the Roman Empire. Specifically, the first principle, authority, and the third principle, uniformity. And so the emperors were operating in this context of the Roman tradition of authority on the one hand, and the Roman tradition of uniformity on the other. Now, in the physical world, uniformity can be understood as standardization. I watched a series of DVDs some time ago concerning the patterns of earlier civilizations that could be unearthed in various cities of England. And in the first program of that series of 6 cities that were being investigated, the discussion was Roman Chester. And in part, the narrator went to and described the vestiges of a Roman fort. There it was in the northwest corner of England at the time. And she said that historians find it easy to analyze the vestiges of Roman forts because they were identical in England, in France, in Italy, in North Africa, in the Near East. Whenever the Roman Empire was operating, it established the pattern for a fort that was exactly the same. And so this policy of standardization in material terms became uniformity in intellectual and theological terms. And so, in effect, what I was hoping to get out of you, and obviously did not, was the answer that the principle of authority linked to uniformity created a situation in which there could not be tolerance of different views. And when we go all the way to the year 451 in Chalcedon, the insistence by the Emperor Marcian in that day led to a split, a 3-way split, whereby the one nature proponents in Alexandria and the Nestorian proponents emphasizing the humanity of Jesus to the eastern parts of the then Roman Empire became estranged from the authorities of the Roman Empire, and subsequently did not do much to assist in the defense of the eastern part of the Roman Empire when the Muslim attack began in the middle of the 600s. So one may talk about this insistence on uniformity as actually promoting the fall of that portion of the Eastern Roman Empire to the armies of the successors of Muhammad, who went all the way across northern Africa and into Spain, because the Christian inhabitants of that region were not about to exert a great effort to defend an empire that was oppressing them theologically. I think without elaborating further, we probably have reached a point whereby it makes sense for me to ask someone to read the final text paragraph and then the 3 ticks at the bottom of page 97 that identify certain works of history that I felt were at least representative of the discussion of these topics that occurred in history. But Charles, would you be willing to do that for us, please? It starts with thus the intense controversies and then goes to the end of the page.
Yes. Thus The intense controversies and debates lasted for just over 125 years. Taken as a whole, the process was extremely contentious, encompassing sudden shifts of mood and numerous political intrigues that clearly affected the deliberations of the bishops. As a brief summary that will have to suffice for our current purposes, here are the titles of 3 relatively recent works written by well-respected historians. The first one, Voting About God in Early Church Council by Ramsey MacMullen. I guess you want me to indicate when they're published, 2006, with that book. The second one listed is The Search for the Christian Doctrine of God, the Arian Controversy, 318 to 381 by R.P.C. Hansen, published in 1988. And the third, Jesus Was, How 4 Patriarchs, 3 Queens, and 2 Emperors Decided What Christians Would Believe for the Next 1,500 Years by Philip Jenkins, published 9 years ago. I wanted to comment on your recent comment.
Okay,
Neil.
go ahead.
As I said, the Roman Empire, the Republic lasted about 300 years, and then it failed, and it was replaced by the Empire, or imperial authority. And the Romans were known for their organization, their authority, their consistency in that regard. You had talked about uniformity. Any effective, and the military for sure, any effective military organization would have to be organized on the principles that the Roman Empire was organized on. You would, for reasons of efficiency and a host of other reasons, to be able to go from defense to offense at will, particularly offense. You did make a link, and you could make an argument that this was reflected in these theological intentions. With or without Christianity, the Romans organized their forces in that manner. I don't think there's a causal relationship between them, more coincidental or overlaps. They said that with or without Christianity, they would have organized that way because it was the most efficient way. They built forts in a uniform manner because that's the least expensive. The Romans were practical, if anything, and certainly in the military structure, military organization, leadership, lines of authority. I think to expect a government or a political system, or say, put it that way, that the Romans created and maintained, which did produce a long period of peace, Pax Romana. To expect them to treat slaves, peasants, merchants as full citizens is absurd. They simply would never do that. It would never even occur to them to do that. If any Roman senator, and bear in mind that during the Republic, the legislature, the Senate, was really a focus of power, not the executive. And the Empire was the other way around. The chief executive, the emperor, was the center of power. If a senator had suggested such a thing, that they had no culture with which to relate it to. Citizenship is an evolutionary achievement, acquirement. It's relatively new. It in concept began in a serious way in Europe and the West in the very late 17th century, but especially the 18th century. Our form of government, for example, in this country is an 18th century institution. And the Romans did not view people in the same light. Of course they wouldn't. They, again, citizenship is an evolutionary requirement, and it simply hadn't evolved. Now, there were Roman citizens, but to be a Roman citizen, you would put duty first, not descent. You would put loyalty first, that is, political loyalty to the crown, if you will, the emperor. And the theological issues, while buffeted certain circles of Roman authority, so that one emperor finally became exasperated. Notwithstanding, I don't think there was any. It was no political possibility for them to offer it to the average person. The average person simply didn't have status. Not until modern democracy, hundreds of years later. Wanted to add that.
Thank you, Charles. Let me follow up in regard to some of your comments. From what you have said, and I largely agree with what you have said, I infer that you would conclude that tolerance and mutual respect was not in the Roman lexicon.
No, I wouldn't make an absolute of it. No, the Romans really didn't. In many respects, they didn't care what you worshipped. Now, eventually, Christianity persisted, and more Romans of all different classes and races were attracted to it. One of the reasons their empire lasted so long was they were politically flexible, but that was for reasons of expediency and their perspective on things. In a sense, the Romans were the Greeks reinvented in a particular domain of human behavior, that is government. And they did emphasize authority and uniformity, etc. But but that doesn't mean that they lasted a long time, because the combination of things. While their military was strong, barbarians on the outside and people on the inside, groups on the inside, were reluctant to challenge them. Some did, even slaves rebelled. But they had a reputation for power, and they were respected for power. I don't mean they were affectionately respected. They were feared and respected for power. They also spread some of the wealth. See, Rome was the gold standard of considered being civilized. The gold standard of being civilized. And so even barbarians, in some cases, who had heard about them beyond the whimsical, or we would call a soundbite, were intrigued and respected it. And they allowed a number of people to become Roman citizens, or to be treated almost as with the same respect. There's a big difference. For example, if you were a Roman citizen, you could not, on the law, be crucified. You were put to death by the sword. If you were not, and capital punishment was warranted, you would be crucified. And there was a big difference. There was a significant difference. For example, Paul was executed, and Peter was executed, and some of the other apostles, and Jesus. They were not, I wouldn't say absolutely they did what you suggest, but they would not brook. Ask the Carthaginians or certain German tribes or the Jews what happened when you antagonized them beyond their limits of tolerance. But ordinarily, they allowed these many subcultures throughout their empire to exist pretty much locally as they wished. You had to be obedient, though, and you had to pay your taxes, that sort of thing. And if you were a citizen, duty and loyalty were much more important than, say, freedom of expression. There's no real mechanism for that. I mean, remember, these are people who terminated the republic, and which is not a democracy. Republic is the representative form of government. It doesn't work the way a democracy does. That's a modern development for an empire, for an imperial authority. And the Christians were still a department, a Roman department in the government, as Constantine viewed them. Only a ruling elite with very definite ideas on authority and power and law and order, especially order, would would adopt such a viewpoint.
Thank you, Charles. You've talked about quite a few different elements. I noticed that Marvin wished to speak, and I will certainly give him the floor in just a second. I would like to add a particular question for Marvin, in addition to whatever impulses he may have that may have caused him to speak. Stephen read the three works of history, the titles. I would like, Marvin, when you finished your own comments on whatever purpose you have, to ask you what it means to say voting about God in early church councils. In particular, do you believe that the bishops who cast these votes had the idea that they were going to change God by the way they voted, or what was their intention? In any case, please go ahead.
Well, the comment I was going to make was sort of building on what Charles said, and really I think the point you're very ably making here, Neil, is the authoritarian and sort of uniform nature and the need to find an official stance grew very much out of Roman culture and Roman tradition. And so I just wanted to say, yeah, it sounds like a very plausible precept, like right on target. Around voting on the nature of God, it's kind of humorous, I think.
Well, I do too, and that's why I wanted you to try to explain what it means. How can you vote about God?
Yeah, I mean, pretty presumptuous that human beings, would get to vote about the nature of the creator that made them. And, this whole, it's something that I wanted to bring up from an earlier discussion about the nature of Jesus. And it's really related to this question as well, is, what we're talking about here from what the Orange Book tells us is fundamentally mystery. We can't define or delineate these realities. We're entirely embryonic on our spiritual nature, and these are sophisticated matters that they're saying even the highest orders of being in the universe are puzzled about aspects related to Jesus' combined nature, and indeed our combined nature as fusions of deity and animal being. At some point in our future, these are ultimate mysteries. So the idea of precisely defining them is really preposterous. They're experiential realities. We experience them. We experience a relationship with Jesus and his nature. We can ask for and receive to some extent the function of the mind of Jesus to aid our minds. So we can experience these things, but to precisely define them is preposterous.
Thank you. I certainly agree with what you've just said, and we'll recognize Stephen in just a moment. The point whereby you described this as a mystery to us, one of many, tallies very well with the comments by a perfecter of wisdom in section 1 of paper 13. In which, in part, he states that the incarnation of the sons, the paradise sons, creator sons, is a mystery. And that this mystery is a secret of Sonarrington that is not revealed to anyone except those paradise sons who have been through the process. And so even for spiritual beings like the revelators, who are vastly senior to us, this is not something that they understand. And yet the early Christians were trying to proclaim doctrines about it. All right, Stephen, your turn.
Well, the idea that these bishops thought that they were precisely or fully defining the nature of God is preposterous. They in no way thought that. It would have been total heresy for anybody to say that they were fully and finally defining the nature of the Godhead. Second of all, in Christianity, there's a very strong tradition called the apophatic tradition that acknowledges first and foremost that God is a mystery and that whatever we can say or think about him is inadequate. So in this discussion, we are focusing on one aspect of Christian thought or Christian evolution, which is called the cataphatic tradition, that does try to put out certain definitions and articulate certain ideas about the nature of God. But to say that that encompasses Christianity is just wrong. There was a very useful purpose to doing this. I mean, if we did not have the doctrine of the Trinity articulated for us in the 4th century AD, that would have been a major loss to our civilization. And I personally am amazed that the Spirit of Truth had as much influence as it did on the evolution of Christian thought. But we are engaging in two big thought errors here, conceptual errors. One is anachronistic thinking, where we are imposing the standards of 21st century civilization and democracy on 2nd and 3rd century civilization, and characters and caricaturization, where we're making general statements about the nature of Christianity that are just inaccurate. And I'm a little frustrated with all this. It's simplistic. It's overly simplistic.
Thank you, Doreen.
Well, I think I found in one of those chapters something I thought was very appropriate, because there were several questions that came up, and I don't remember who wrote it. And it said, they were asking about Jesus. How did he show his divinity as a man? What was the nature of his teachings, the miracles? Did he have an inability, to commit sin? Resurrection, did he have emotions? I mean, you'd think of human beings wanting to figure out who he actually is. Did he switch from being divine to human at will? Could he suffer pain? If yes, what was the point of his crucifixion? So you look at something from their point of view, as Stephen said, 2,000 years ago, and how do they understand him? How could they figure out who he actually was? So these discussions went on, I should say, at least for 125 years, if not much longer. And the only thing that personally I could say, not because I read the whole Urantia book at the time, but when I did come across his teachings, and I think they had the Spirit of Truth and Thought of Justice at that time as well, that it just spoke to me. And it wasn't, what did I care about, his materialization or his spirituality? It was so beautiful. So if you say that all this was in the Bible and that at that time, I have no idea. But if they did, what were they focusing on? I mean, what was important? Maybe it's very male, maybe it's the church, and like you said, they do like uniformity. But it blew me away just to think about when he spoke and the things he said, it so resonated within me that not knowing him at all from any perspective, I just fell in love with him. And that was like, wow, is this what the Spirit of Truth does? Is this how it speaks to us through, the agencies of the Thought of Justice and the Holy Spirit? And here they're so disconcerted about that, as far as I understand, and all the things that I'm reading. It never said anything about how beautiful his teachings were. I don't know, but even to say one more thing is that even the apostles were, trying to, at the beginning years, they were fighting amongst themselves, how we should do this. So I could understand confusion begets more confusion. But anyway, from my perspective, I'm just coming not from the history and the background, and I found it really just overwhelmingly too much information about how they couldn't understand, what his composure was. I just, material or spiritual, I just thought, I don't know, does it matter? Because even the prophets of old understood things, through divine revelation, personal revelation. What was operating then? And that's all. I just, to me, I don't know. It left me very flat, confused.
I think that your comments are in not exactly the same spirit as some of what Stephen has said, but there is a similarity. In effect, what I hear from you is that a lot of this argument that went on for that 125 years seems to you either pointless or very difficult to understand. Why did they do it? And frankly, I have a similar feeling. Now, I would like to clarify the nature of my question earlier. I did not write the book, Voting About God in Early Church Councils. That was written by Ramsay MacMullen. But it's obvious to all of us that the bishops, being intelligent human beings, even though they were all intelligent men, and I realize that's a disadvantage for at least one of our participants today, we're not really thinking that their votes were going to determine God, or for that matter, influence God. But they were voting about something. What is it that they were voting about? Bob, will you try that?
Get myself unmuted there, Neil. Well, we go back to the idea of uniformity. The emperors were, I make this point again and again, we're trying to control these activists the way that I'm perceiving them. The spirit of truth, I've felt, has been active and started to catalyze this cacophony, as you used. And I sincerely believe that in studying that part of history, I'm still amazed at the fact that there were 300 to 500 bishops at the time that were in local dioceses that were dealing with the local individual who was concerned about understanding their religion. Steve brought up the idea of the Trinity not being lost, and that was another point that I wanted to make here. The fact that they were at that time trying to come to some consensus, and that's what the voting is about, to get to a uniform thought so that we can get on with business of religion, so to speak, and control this secular part of society where the emperor has to be able to dictate whatever he needed to dictate and run his armies and standardize his certainly expand his empire. But so I'll get to voting in a second, but I want to think, I thought about what Steve said about the Trinity, that it was not lost. And I found that kind of fascinating, to be honest with you, because in the paper on the growth of the Trinity concept, we see these ideas of the triads, and even in the Eastern philosophies, this idea of threesomeness came into being, and trying to develop a concept of that Trinity was probably the right step to take at the time to not lose the concept. And why is understanding the Trinity so important? Well, I kind of had to get back to Melchizedek, who were the great teachers in our Revelation, and I want to read something from the Religion Papers, 10426. The conceptual grasp of the Trinity association of the Father, Son, and Spirit prepares the human mind for the further presentation of other threefold relationships. Theological reason may be fully satisfied by the concept of a paradise Trinity, but philosophical and cosmological reason demand the recognition of other triune associations of the first source, the center, those triunities in which the infinite functions in various non-father capacities of universal manifestation. relationships of God of force, energy, power, causation, reaction, potentiality, actuality, gravity, tension, pattern, principle, and unity. Frankly, I think that if you look at the forward in the in the papers, they discuss this that it's important from time to time to raise the thought of where we've been before. The fact that the Council of Nicaea and the two that ended in Chalcedon talk so much about the Trinity to try and even understand that and what Jesus's relationship was with that was. I think a key aspect of the spirit of truth that was actually acting upon humans at the time to be able to not lose that particular thought. Almost as strong as the idea that Melchizedek had to restore and validate the monotheistic concept, certainly among the Bedouins and the Hebrews. So this idea of uniformity is, I think, was important. And over time, what we're finding is that you can't contain the human spirit. By the Renaissance, it was about to explode, which is what it did, and that's what we're seeing today with so many creeds and doctrines trying to figure the rest of this out. It was certainly time for an upstepping revelation such as what we have today in the fifth epoch of Revelation. Over.
Thank you. Well, I've tried several times, and now I will advance my own tentative answer to the question that I've been asking. What were they voting on? They were voting on the doctrines and creeds that they intended to impose on believers. This was a disciplinary matter. They were coming to a conclusion on the framework for Christianity as they understood it. That was what they were voting on. They obviously knew that they weren't going to change God by their votes, but they were going to change the teachings of the church in relation to God. And they intended to enforce those beliefs on individuals. Stephen, you asked to speak.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of respond to what Doreen was saying. What amazes me about this whole era was the passion in which these bishops and with what Christians in general were feeling about these theological issues. St. John Chrysostom, who was a saint of the Eastern Orthodox area, made a funny comment about this. He said, I can't even walk into a bakery in Constantinople without being accosted by the baker who wants to know what I think of the relationship between prosopon, which is person, and ousia, which is nature. So the passion that was demonstrated by all these bishops and common people, I find absolutely amazing and dwarfs whatever feelings we may have about theology or the nature of God or even religion in general. Second of all, I would just like to say that reading the Urantia book, which for me was very much like for Doreen, but for 99.9% of people, the Urantia book is going to leave people flat because it is so intellectual and so filled with jargon. And you compare that to the New Testament, which spread like wildfire because it spoke the language of the people. It spoke in terms of stories and narratives and miracles and parables and mysteries. Parable, by the way, means mystery. And it spread like wildfire. So we have a lot of second guessing to do in terms of how we're going to convert our revelation into something that's even as tenth as effective as the New Testament was 1,500 years ago.
Thank you. I think we've come to a reasonable conclusion in regard to this discussion of those works of history. Obviously, there were many different sides to the contentions. People had different views. The context of tolerance was essentially not an option because of the practice of uniformity and insistence on authority of the government in part. So there we are. That's what happened. Therefore, I would like to call on another person who has not yet read to read the creed on page 98, I should say the statement on page 98, the Chalcedonian definition. Bob, would you be willing to do that? Just go ahead and read the entire page, please.
Sure. Would you like me to start at the top of page 98, Neil?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. At the Council of Chalcedon, 451 CE, the assembled bishops adopted the following detailed statement in which they portrayed the nature and identity of Jesus. Now you have a footnote there. Would you like me to go down to the footnote?
No, the footnote says that I drew it from the internet, and specifically a website having to do with the Anglican Church. But go ahead.
Okay. So it's in the box here. Therefore, following the Holy Fathers, we all with one accord teach men to acknowledge one and the same Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, at once complete in Godhead and complete in manhood, truly God and truly man, consisting also of a reasonable soul and body, of one substance with the Father as regards his Godhead, and at the same time of one substance with us as regards his manhood, like us in all respects, apart from sin, as regards his Godhead, begotten of the Father before the ages, but yet as regards his manhood begotten for us men and for our salvation, Mary the Virgin, the God-bearer, one and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, recognized in two natures without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. The distinction of natures being in no way annulled by the union, but rather the characteristics of each nature being preserved and coming together to form one person and one subsistence, not as parted or separated into two persons, but one and the same Son and only begotten God the Word, Lord Jesus Christ, even as the prophets from earliest times spoke of him, and our Lord Jesus Christ himself taught us, and the creed of the fathers has handed down to us. Translation from Bennis and Henry, Documents of the Christian Church.
Thank you. I think there are many lines in this definition, the Chalcedonian definition, that we could probably elaborate on. It would be too great a level of detail, in my opinion. I sympathize with those who have proceeded in earlier parts of this discussion that we really are getting down to fine details. But my question is precisely that. How did they come up with all these fine details and then insist on it as a touchstone of Orthodox received opinion about Christianity? Marvin, would you deal with that, please?
You're saying the question you're asking is how do they come up with that?
Where did they get all these ideas? And yes, how did they come up with it?
Well, I'd have to say on both those counts, I'm afraid I don't know. So I have to plead ignorance and probably don't have much to say. My reaction to the document itself is that's relatively important, what they said. I mean, it's a lot of words to say, but I think it's relatively important. And in common plain language, for my own personal experiential relevance and use, I would sort of restate it to say, you know, Jesus was fully a divine being. I mean, so there was no diminishment of godly nature in him, which made him unlike any other human being. And at the same time, Jesus was fully a human being, which means I can really relate to him. And the struggles that he experienced were human struggles, and the situations he lived in were human situations. And so his life is profoundly relevant for me as a human being. And furthermore, he was saying that this combined nature was at the heart of the gospel, that we are combined beings in some similar fashion. We are a mixture of divinity and humanity. And that's a profound statement, you know. He was fully so, and we are evolutionarily so. But so I find it a profound statement and relevant. So, I mean, after 125 years, it says something that for me seems rather worthwhile.
Thank you. The intention of my question had to do with the process that led to this statement, but I appreciate your analysis of the contents It is the statement that prevailed in Western Christianity, and subsequently many Western theologians have praised it for its clarity and coherence. And I'm not in this role as the moderator to argue with that or with you. But what I'm in effect posing is the comparison of the detail and clarity of this statement with, I think, the very skimpy references in the New Testament that are relevant. Earlier, Doreen talked about certain elements that related to the spiritual nature of Jesus, and there are other passages that relate to the human nature of Jesus. But the argument that went on for 125 years largely reflected the fact that the documents in the New Testament could be interpreted from different perspectives, and that people who had already decided what they believed could wrestle up a whole selection of quotations that would serve their purpose, that would lead to the conclusion that they had in the first place. Charles, would you like to comment on this, please?
Well, I can only guess as to how. From what I understand about truth and the discernment of truth and the acquirement of truth and the living of truth, and it goes for beauty and goodness as well, is that you can see its fruits. If it has validity, it'll be evident in the fruit. How Jesus answered Peter on occasion, how can we tell? A Godhead or a being who bestows himself with this kind of nature and intent and consistency and humility and strength could talk with authority about the temple of the spiritual brotherhood. Such a person this attempts to describe could talk about, my kingdom is not of this world, and make sense of that, and yet connect it and tie it to this world at the same time. And the Marvin's the characterization, I think, speaks to this. It's the fruit of it is relatively sophisticated. Remember, this is an evolutionary religion with the influence of a revelation in part of its origin in history. So from an evolutionary standpoint, the way that distinction is applied in the Rancher book, it's relatively sophisticated. It's impressive. It has power. There's value. There's hope in it, these words. It's relatively comprehensible. You wouldn't need to be a theologian to benefit from this. You might want to be a theologian to explore implications, supposed implications included, but you wouldn't need to be a theologian to understand it. Not its essence, not its essential character. So it's a relatively sophisticated evolutionary declaration, seems to me. And notwithstanding certain details, Mary the Virgin, the God-bearer. One can take them for task for that. But if that's what you focus on, you would lose sight of the beauty of the rest of it. And in my experience, in my religious experience, personal religious experience, and my observations of the religious experience, personal of others, of my fellow mortals, it's the spirit of truth leading us to the indwelling fatherly spirit that elevates us. When Jesus said, "My kingdom, the kingdom of God is within you, and my kingdom is not of this world," when you understand those two statements, have any real understanding, he changed the whole potential for the destiny of his movement, the religion of Jesus. That destiny is still unfolding. It's still being worked out. And these are words that will never die. These are promises and statements that will never die. They will live forever. They will outlast. They have the power to outlast whole worlds. And they are Alpha and Omega. So, for an evolutionary effort, I give it the higher mark, not lower.
May I put you on the spot? I always like to do that, Charles.
You may.
All right. The question is whether or not you believe that the Holy Spirit or the Spirit of Truth or the adjutant mind spirits had a voice in helping the various theologians and bishops draft this statement.
I don't see how it could be otherwise. Even if they were influenced from their point of view in an indirect way, or not always in a direct way. Just on the strength, on the premise that the Spirit of Truth made it facilitated the universal dispensation, essentially, of thought and justice for this world. The first time in our world history. How could it be otherwise? And take the spirit of what Stephen had said, at least as I understand it in one of his comments. We want to be careful not to overthink this or compartmentalize it. We certainly want to strengthen our faith. I don't mean not doing that. We want to strengthen our faith. We want to discern increasingly truth, beauty, and goodness. I mean, but we shouldn't, on the other hand, we want to be careful not to compartmentalize between local universe, Mother Spirit, the Creator Son's Michael Spirit, the direct influence of Jesus when he was here, and his continued influence, and his promise to return. I'm sure there are distinctions between them and others, including angels, the work of angels, to be made. But and Marvin also made this point. We're not capable, really, of separating them all out. But I'm quite certain the Spirit of Truth, which, of course, is a fatherly spirit, and the local universe Mother Spirit, in her in a manner of her own choosing, had, I wouldn't say had a hand in it, but were maybe co-authors of a certain kind. But I'm not sure, I couldn't even imagine how that could be. Because they're extraordinary, they're phenomenal personalities with phenomenal natures, but I'm impressed with the relative simplicity of it from a theologically complex point of view, and its approachability to a soul searching for God. This would be helpful, not unhelpful. It would be quite helpful, and especially for an evolutionary statement.
Thank you, Charles. I appreciate your comments. They were quite interesting, as is always the case. I would simply say that if we look at this document as a spiritual statement, it has considerable merit. I share your misgivings about the remarks concerning Mary, the mother of Jesus, and so on. But the history of this as a document, unfortunately, perpetuated a very strong split among Christian believers that persists to this day. There are still people who are in the Nestorian mode. The Coptic Church in Egypt is in the one nature mode. And so the eastern half of Christianity as it then existed was antagonized by the enforcement procedures of the Roman Empire as it then existed from its headquarters in Constantinople. And the net result was to facilitate the conquest of these lands later by the Muslim attackers who ran all the way across northern Africa and into Spain because the population felt oppressed by the authority of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, the last point having to do with the politics of this and the Roman Empire as an institution is the subject of a quotation from paper 195, specifically paper 195, section 3, paragraph 9, in which the Midwayers comment on the eventual fall of the Roman Empire, at least in the West. Here is what the Midwayers say. Quote, even a good religion could not save a great empire from the sure results of lack of individual participation in the affairs of government, from overmuch paternalism, overtaxation and gross collection abuses, unbalanced trade with the Levant, which drained away the gold, amusement madness, Roman standardization, the degradation of women, slavery and race decadence, physical plagues, and a state church which became institutionalized nearly to the point of spiritual barrenness. So I put that paragraph by the Midwayer Commission alongside some of your earlier comments about the principles of Roman government. And notice here that Roman standardization was a feature that the Midwayer Commission commented on in the middle of that paragraph, and that they concluded with the words, a state church which became institutionalized nearly to the point of spiritual barrenness. Well, having read that paragraph, I'm certainly going to offer the opportunity for comments on it to anyone who wishes to venture, but I don't insist. So if I see a request to speak on this question, I will certainly recognize that person, but otherwise we will go on. Marvin?
I just wanted to connect up an earlier set of comments that Stephen made about cataphatic and apophatic approaches in Christianity. And I'd be interested in Stephen, your thoughts, or anyone's thoughts, actually. You know, the book makes a distinction between the teachings of Paul, and Peter, which eventuated in the Roman papacy, ultimately. I mean, through many steps. And I'm not sure if there's any similar direct lineage or any lineage at all between Abner's work in the East and the development of the more eastern forms of Christianity. But I do know that the Orthodox churches, I believe it's correct to say they have a more apophatic approach. In other words, another way of saying that is they have a more mystical approach, and more of an approach that emphasizes the unity of God and the ineffability of that unity, and mystical approach to union, the whole practice with icons, which are sort of merging with the icon in a mystical process as a spiritual practice. And that all in contradistinction to this nearly entirely moribund effort in Western Catholic tradition of a church that so killed living spiritual experience that it became nothing more than a shell and very brittle and non-living, non-surviving. So I'm curious about this the apophatic cataphatic distinction and how it threads its way through Western and Eastern church, and any tie to Peter and Paul's effort versus Abner's effort.
Stephen, Marvin specifically referred to you, and so now that you have put your hand up, I will give you the floor.
Well, it's true that the apophatic tradition had a strong influence in the Orthodox churches. At the same time, the Orthodox churches were just as dogmatic, if not even more so, than the Roman Church. So that's a bit of a paradox, but I think it's accurate. I think there's another church that we don't talk about here in the West that's not Roman and it's not Orthodox. It's not Eastern Orthodox. It's the Church of the East. And that's really where Abner was. He was in Mesopotamia. and Syriac Christianity, which was very much based on Jewish Christianity. And it was much stricter, much more ascetic, and experientially much more dogmatic. As the book says, that Abner was a very, very strict theologically and practically. That's why his brand of Christianity didn't flourish, because it was so strictly dogmatic in many ways. So I don't think that Abner had a direct effect on Orthodox Christianity. I think that mindset probably had more of an effect on Islam and the birth of Islam in Arabia than it did on the Orthodox Church. That's a very, very interesting historical sideline, you might say. It's not really a sideline, we just don't know about it. But there is stuff written about that that's pretty fascinating. Just to answer Neil's earlier question about this creed here from Chalcedon, I believe it's the fruit of both the third and fourth epical revelations and personal spiritual revelations to individuals in Judaism and in Christianity. And it's the work of the Spirit of Truth in conjunction with epical and personal revelation, combined with the credible men of dialogue and mental passion and spiritual passion that created the will to make a document like this that was accessible and articulated the nature of divinity for so many people. So this can't be disregarded as anything but the fruit of epical and personal revelation.
Thank you.
Neil?
Charles, yes?
Just to put it into perspective, in a very brief comment on Stephen's, I think, excellent observation, set of observations. 41 years before this statement was finalized, the city of Rome was sacked by those who they referred to for centuries as barbarians. And that was in the year 410 CE. And then 25 years after this document, the last Roman Empire, the last Roman emperor passed this way. So when this was done in the 451, Rome was finished as an empire.
In the West.
In the West. A great and powerful force, an organized force for roughly 6 centuries, expired. Obviously, it was declining dramatically, apropos the Midway's characterization. Stephen also made a comment, which I interpreted as for this Chalcedon document as a testament to Christian vitality, notwithstanding the final collapse of the Western part of the empire, Roman Empire. There must have been, this document tells me, at the same time, a current or undercurrent or both of Christian, what I'll call Christian vitality. There's energy behind this, in terms of the spirit, seems to me. Real energy. And I think it speaks to the power of religion, that it can continue even when the world around it, largely the material world around it, collapses. What they had known and what was the norm for so long ceased to be. And indeed, those subsequent centuries, the next 4 or 5, would be referred to as the Dark Ages, which historians debate as to the accuracy. But nonetheless, Rome did collapse, and this saw its sunset, the sunset of the Roman Empire. And I think Stephen's remarks should be well taken with regard to the vitality of the Christian spirit, notwithstanding, and other issues, other problems, notwithstanding.
Thank you. I believe, Bob, you asked to be recognized.
Just really briefly, everything Marvin Charles and Stephen have just said about the how, I think I have to agree with. Stephen characterized it probably the best, where, as I understood it, Steve, you took all of the current and historical evolutionary growth, as well as the fourth epochal revelation, and all of that was supported, catalyzed, energized by the Spirit of Truth, as we've all been talking about here, as well as thought adjusters and self-revelation. I think you mentioned self-revelation in there also. So the how, Neil, your primary question was, how did all this stuff happen? I think answers it fairly well. That's speculation, of course. My first thought was, well, that's all self-revelation, and they're voting. they all had to come to some consensus because of this need for uniformity to be able to quell these, what I still claim were fractious and bumptious activists during the time, and it was done. And it was done. And it took another 1,000 years for it to then break apart again. And frankly, I think that the revelators said, okay, it's time. We've got to advance cosmic consciousness. Let's get the fifth epochal revelation out. That's my thought about all that. And it was an interesting question, because I think it stumped a few of us until we started thinking about it. So thanks for that one, Neil. Over.
Well, thank you. And I would comment from my perspective as the author of Revelation Revealed. I appreciate several of you who liked my phrase fractious and bumptious. That was an original description of mine. I think it was justified, and it seems to me largely borne out in the historical excerpts that I circulated to you. They were fractious. They were arguing over small points, and they enjoyed the argument in addition to hoping they would win. So there was a pride of authorship, perhaps. But there was also a native bumptiousness. They all wanted to proclaim themselves, to acquire power and authority. So these two traits made the arguments more difficult. And I suppose one could say, well, fractiousness and bumptiousness are part of human nature. And I would agree with that. But they took it to a very concentrated level in these extreme arguments that they had. Doreen, I would like you now, if you are willing, to turn over to page 99 and read the first two paragraphs, followed by the words in quotations, which are a selection from the Nicene Creed as modified during the Council of Constantinople.
Okay. I did want to mention something about it, but never mind. I don't know if we'll have time. The statement, which is often called the Chalcedonian definition, the Chalcedonian Creed or the Chalcedonian formula, became standard doctrine of the institutional Christian church. As previously stated, the bishops who participated in the extended series of church councils also examined the spiritual relationships that characterize and define the Trinity. During the Council of Constantinople, 381, you said it's not the common era, but that's how I understood it, additional wording related to the Holy Spirit. And let's see.
Why don't you read the rest of the paragraph, and then you can read the footnote, because in this case, the footnote is interesting.
Okay. Thank you. The Holy Spirit was added to the Nicene Creed, which therefore is a very formal sense, should actually be called the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. And the footnote said, it is important to bear in mind that in traditional Christian theology, the phrase, the Holy Spirit, refers to the third person of the Trinity as Christians conceive it. In contrast, however, the revelators tell us that the third person of the Paradise Trinity is the infinite Spirit, and they use the phrase, the Holy Spirit, to refer to the spiritual ministry that the creative mother spirit of Nebadon carries out of her own behalf, on her own behalf.
return to the main body of the text, please?
Okay, so wait a minute.
In the sentence that appears below.
Relations, is that where I am?
No,
Oh, in the sentence that appears below, the words shown in italics are mainly those that were added during the Council of Constantinople. On the other hand, the three words within brackets and the Son are an exception, for they were not adopted at that time. To the contrary, Western Christians inserted this idea long after the Council of Constantinople had adjourned, apparently making a definitive decision to do that after at least 100 years had elapsed, and probably a longer period. In contrast, Eastern Orthodox Christians have never accepted the insertions. Relations between the ecclesiastical...
Please read the quotation in the red box.
I'm sorry. Yep. See, mine didn't print out, but I had it on a different paper.
It goes, I believe in the Holy Spirit.
Ooh, let me see.
If you're having trouble locating it, I will read it if you
Yeah, read it, because it didn't print out on my sheet.
Okay, thank you. This is a quotation from the Creed, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, if I can manage that. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son is adored and glorified, who has spoken through the prophets.
Okay. Relation.
I want to pause now for us to discuss what has just gone by. Okay. Once again, the words in brackets and the Son were added in the West over 100 years after the Council of Constantinople. Well, this was a huge argument.
Yep.
But before we get into the argument between Eastern Christians and Western Christians, I would like to talk about the underlying issue. Why is it important how the Holy Spirit proceeds in the Trinity? Charles?
Well, it's an important leg in the stool. There has to be an explanation. I think their answer book persuaded me that accounts for space being ubiquitous. In other words, an everywhere, anywhere presence. And my phone battery is very low. That's why it's doing it. I'm going to the room now. Well, I think it's to the father-son distinction wouldn't necessarily account for that. Call on somebody else. I have to get another phone.
Thank you. Marvin has decided to relieve you, Charles, since you're in obvious need.
I felt your need there, Charles, and said, oh, better jump in here. What struck me about this is the description in the Urantia book where they say that the Father begat the Son. You know, begat, they didn't use that terminology, but the Father, on some sense, the eternal Son proceeds out of the intention, out of the Father. Father is the original conception, and the Son is the word or expression of that conception, in a sense. And obviously, I'm speaking very metaphorically. We're using human language for eternal realities. But then they say that the Father and the Son, the universal Father and the eternal Son together, gave issue to the infinite Spirit. So it was the intention of the Father and the Son that resulted in the existence of the Spirit. Speaking again metaphorically and in temporal sequence, when indeed these things are eternal realities. But still, it says something about the relationship of the Son and the Son's intentions to the reality of the infinite Spirit, and that it wasn't just the Father that intended the realization of the infinite Spirit. And if I remember correctly, the Father and the Son conceive of the plan of creation, and the infinite Spirit is the executionary agent of that plan. And it's what's important to me, which syncs up with this issue, is whether that alone was the Father's conception and intention alone, or it was the conception and the intention of the first two persons of deity, the plan of creation, including the existence of the infinite spirit as the executive agent of that plan.
Marvin, I will congratulate you in amassing an impressive collection of buzzwords and phrases that certainly have a very technical meaning. On the one hand, you've stated that all these factors that you've described are eternal realities, and then you've also given a sequential interpretation. I think, in fairness to you, and likewise in fairness to the revelators, they state that human language is not sufficient and that human understanding is not sufficient. And further, I would comment that a good deal of the philosophic interpretation that you provided has to do with the segmentation of a concept which the revelators introduce to us as the Father hyphen I am. And then they theorize on how the Father hyphen I am differentiated and so on. While they are doing that, they also explain that this is purely theoretical and purely arbitrary, because all of these beings of the seven persons of infinity, I believe the word person is there, are existential, existed from eternity, and had no time relationship. So here we are, we're talking about this. It is interesting, at the very least, that the early Christians were focusing on these questions as a matter of theological construction. I believe that we have now reached a point where it would be beneficial to carry over this question of the relationship of the Spirit and the ensuing controversy between the Eastern and Western halves of Christianity as the launch point for our discussion next week. Does anyone wish to make a comment or a concluding remark?
Well, you have to end. I had researched the 20 centuries of the Orthodox Christian Church and what they believe. So I did want to share it, but I'll save it for next week. That's not a problem.
If it fits in next week, and it probably would, then I think perhaps I would ask you to let it go, because if you launch into it, then I have to encourage others to reply, and it's better to do that next week.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Now that I've said thank you to you, then I have to say thank you, gentlemen, because the rest of them are all men. So I've enjoyed this very interesting discussion. We have had some points at which there were some disagreements, but that, frankly, is a hallmark of our series. We recognize pluralism and diversity. We are not looking for a lowest common denominator. And I appreciate the intelligence and the insight and the perceptiveness that all of you have demonstrated, not only today, but throughout the entire series.
We're trying not to be fractious and bumptious here.
Well, you're allowed to be bumptious.
I think as long as you don't have to say those two words too often, it will be okay. I'd hate to have to repeat them, say 5 times in a row.
Well, Charles, you can experiment with that when your battery has been replenished, all right?
It has been, and I'm not going to. I'll continue shoveling snow. It's a nice thing to shovel.
All right. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll sign off for today.
Thanks, everyone.
Good day. Okay. Adios.
Bye-bye.